Is this the end of ISIS?
I think it is far too early to pop open the champagne. What we're seeing is ISIS being pushed back, but this is not the end of ISIS. So there's an important way that we need to think about ISIS. What is it? Well, it's essentially holding three different forms simultaneously. It has been a proto-state occupying large parts of Syria and Iraq, trying to govern and trying to be a government and so on and so forth. It's also been an insurgency, which it continues to be, and a terrorist movement, which it continues to be. This military campaign that we've seen so far and the pushback against ISIS in Raqqa and in Mosul is really only addressing one aspect of its identity, and that's the proto-state aspect of it.
So do we expect now to see it kind of morph back into that insurgency movement that it really sprung from?
Absolutely. I think that's very important to appreciate. It came from being an insurgent group, principally in Iraq. It then capitalized on the deteriorating security situation in Syria, moved in there, established a foothold for itself before taking over both countries. So ISIS has this ability to morph both ways, and we've already seen after the fall of Mosul and now in Raqqa, it's been pulling back into Deir ez-Zor, into the eastern parts of the country, essentially retreating to the desert. Now, you can encircle a large urban center like Raqqa, like Mosul, and take it back, but you can't encircle the desert. So they are pulling back, getting ready to fight another day.
You know, you have obviously, in the course of your research for your various books and your academic work, you have talked to a lot of Western ISIS fighters, and they, for such a long time, played such a major role in propaganda efforts. Do you have any sense, because we don't hear as much from them now, do you have any sense of how many of them are still alive, what they're doing now? They're clearly not in Raqqa anymore.
A number of those fighters were killed, of course, in a lot of the campaigns that ISIS was fighting as it was losing territory. But you're right, they did go off the radar. They weren't so prolific or prominent in spreading propaganda in the way they used to be during the high watermark of this movement in 2014 or 15. But increasingly, as the situation became ever more desperate, in Raqqa, for example, as it became more encircled, as they lost more and more territory and pulled back, you did get the odd message coming out of Raqqa. So a British foreign fighter from Birmingham in the Midlands in the UK did send out a very angry and very impassioned call about what was happening in the city about 10 days ago now. So that was one unique voice that we heard. It's quite rare now to hear those types of voices. We've seen the odd other message pop up here and there from other foreign fighters, but it's really symptomatic of the fact that they're becoming desperate again, and they're trying to get a message out to the world that they want people to pull off attacks in the West.
And I think that obviously raises the concern about what threat they might pose. I want to play you some sound right now that we have from the head of Britain's MI5 intelligence agency, where he talks about this very issue of the issue of Western fighters and what kind of threat. Here, take a listen.
It's clear that we're contending with an intense UK terrorist threat from Islamist extremists. That threat is multidimensional, evolving rapidly, and operating at a scale and pace we've not seen before.
I mean, you heard he's basically saying it's an unprecedented level. Does the collapse of Raqqa affect this in some way? Does it make people safer? Does it prevent more terrorist attacks from happening?
Well, counterintuitively, actually, I think in the immediate short term, probably in medium term, it increases the threat to us. We shouldn't lose track of the key issue here. It's important to beat ISIS back in Syria and Iraq. It's important that their state project collapses and that they're on the back foot. But as that happens, the messaging changes and the strategic imperatives for ISIS change as well. So in 2013, in 2014 and 15, they were saying to people, come here and join us, come and be part of this caliphate. This is your state. And people flocked there in their thousands, tens of thousands in many cases. Now what they're saying, as they're on the back foot, don't come here, do something at home. We'd like you to stay in your home countries and pull off an attack. So that dynamic now of sort of redirecting people who are sympathetic to their cause and to their message means that the threat does grow for us. And as you heard in those comments just before, that threat is quite unprecedented and quite sharp at this moment in time.
What about morale? Does it have an impact on ISIS fighters or would-be ISIS fighters when they're sitting at home and gone are the glory days of ISIS tanks doing donuts in the central square of Raqqa? Now we're looking at devastation, demolition, the caliphate is crumbling. Does that have an effect on the psyche? Does it have an impact on the recruitment drive?
I think it does in some senses, and this is why it's important to push ISIS back. ISIS is perhaps the only terrorist group that we've known of that had its own strapline, remaining and expanding. And in 2014 it was. It was winning on the ground. Whenever we talked about ISIS, we always saw those images of it producing these military parades through Raqqa, Mosul, and other parts. That appealed to young people who were somewhat sympathetic to its cause. They wanted to be part of this winning team, to be part of a movement that seemed to have momentum, success, and drive on its side. Now, ISIS is not remaining and expanding. It's shrinking and dying. That's a lot less attractive to a young person. Now what you're seeing is that message filtering through to this ultra-hardcore, so that casual observer or sympathizer isn't interested anymore. You're sort of getting down to the more sort of zealot pool of people who are really committed to its cause.
And how much of an effect do you think, the tech giants have really been under enormous political pressure to take steps to stop the spreading and proliferation of this message? How effective do you think, based on your observations, they've been in this endeavor? Has it had the intended consequence of damaging ISIS's propaganda and recruitment campaigns?
I think no one could deny that direction of travel we've seen from the major tech companies has been broadly in the right direction. You cannot access mainstream ISIS propaganda through big platforms like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube in the way you used to be able to 3 or 4 years ago. That same volume, scale, intensity just simply doesn't exist anymore. So they are moving broadly in the right direction. There's still, of course, a lot of work for them to do, but these are really difficult issues with a whole surrounding package of moral, legal, ethical, free speech consequences as well. So they're working through that. But the direction of travel is important. We are seeing this material coming down. But of course, the jihadis are not wedded or indebted to any one particular platform. As soon as the operating environment became harder on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, they moved. And they exist on a platform called Telegram, semi-encrypted. And that is a platform now where myself and my colleagues are spending a lot of our time trying to understand this group better, what they're up to next. And the volume, I can tell you, on Telegram is staggering.
And just to close, I mean, it comes back as well to the conditions that created ISIS, whether in Raqqa or elsewhere. They have not been changed significantly. You look at the Syrian battlefield, you look at Raqqa collapses, who takes over? I mean, do you see any real shift on the ground in Syria in terms of who will control Raqqa and who will control all of this ISIS territory eventually that leads you to believe we're safe from the return of a group like ISIS or some other form of it?
I mean, we're nowhere near seeing the end of this. I think you make a very valid point. Just as I said earlier, ISIS is not one thing. The Syrian war is not a war. It's a series of multiple wars happening simultaneously within a particular theater. There is an ethnic component to this conflict, a sectarian component, a jihadist and secularist component, a regime versus these people component. All these different things. There is no Marshall Plan to rebuild Raqqa. People remain insecure, desperate, and those are the conditions a jihadist group like ISIS
That's exactly it. There is no Marshall Plan. Shiraz Maher, thank you so much for being with us on the program.